Have you ever stayed too long in a place where you were never truly seen? Not because you were weak, but because a part of you kept hoping that one day they might finally notice what you've carried in silence. Emma Carlyle was that person. For years, she stood beside a man everyone respected but no one truly knew. She wasn't just his secretary, she was his shadow, his steady hand, his silence keeper, until the day she walked into his office, placed her resignation letter on his desk, and turned to leave with tears in her eyes. But then, something unexpected happened. Richard Langston, the cold, unreachable CEO, locked the door. And what he said next shattered every wall she'd built to survive him. What would you do if the one who always overlooked you finally begged you to stay? Would you trust them again, or walk away for good this time? This isn't just a story about love. It's about being invisible, being loyal, and one day, being brave enough to choose yourself. Stay with us, because sometimes the quietest people have the loudest stories to tell. It was just past 6:00 p.m. when the office lights dimmed into their automatic evening mode. Outside, the streets of downtown Chicago gleamed with red brake lights and a fine sheen of early October drizzle. The office on the 27th floor of Langston and Reeves Architects had mostly emptied out. Desks sat in silence, chairs tucked in neatly, papers stacked in the quiet order of a day completed, except one person wasn't done. Emma Carlyle stood in front of Richard Langston's office door, her hand gently curled around a plain manila envelope. The letter inside was only a single paragraph, printed in 12-point Times New Roman, signed in blue ink with a flourish that felt more final than she'd expected. She hadn't rehearsed it. She hadn't even cried when she typed it. But now, standing here, her chest tight, her throat raw from a silence that had gone on too long, she felt it rising uncontrollably. Richard was at his desk, the blinds half drawn, city lights casting fractured shadows across his face. He didn't look up when she knocked, just that said, without emotion, "Come in." She stepped inside, the scent of cedar and leather, always faint in the room, greeted her like an old ache. She held the envelope tightly in one hand, the other clenched slightly at her side. Richard glanced up finally, pen still in hand, his expression unreadable. "I'm resigning," she said softly, and placed the envelope on his desk. For a moment, nothing moved. His eyes dropped to the envelope, lingered there, then lifted to hers. He saw it then, the redness around her eyes, the slight tremble in her shoulders, the way she was standing too still, too formally, like a woman trying not to fall apart in front of someone who wouldn't catch her. "You're serious," he said. She didn't answer, only gave a small nod. That was all she had left dignity, and the ability to walk away quietly. When she turned to leave, her fingers reached for the handle of the tall glass door, but before they could wrap around it, there was a soft click, not from her hand, but from his. Richard had stood. Without raising his voice, without rushing, he reached the side wall, pressed the lock on the door, a quiet sound, but it echoed in that tense, hollow space. Emma froze. She didn't turn. She just stood there, her back to him, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. "You're not leaving," he said. "Not like this." Her voice cracked slightly when she replied, still not turning around. "Please don't make this harder." "I'm not trying to," he said, his tone low, more tired than sharp. "But you're about to walk away without knowing anything that matters." She turned then slowly and looked at him. He looked different. Or maybe it was that she'd never let herself look this long before. Richard Langston, CEO, visionary architect, and the man who never blinked in boardrooms looked tired. Not in the physical sense. Something inside him looked worn down, frayed at the seams. Emma stepped away from the door but didn't move further. Her hands were now at her sides, empty, vulnerable. "You never made space for me," she said. "Not once. Not as a professional. Not as a person. Not even when I stood next to you through everything. You don't know what that space looked like from my side," he answered. "It wasn't emptiness. It was a wall I didn't know how to bring down." Her breath caught. Richard took one slow step toward her, then another. But he didn't touch her, didn't try to close the distance completely. "You think I didn't notice you," he said, quieter now. "You think I didn't see you walking in early, staying late, catching my mistakes before anyone else even dared to speak. You've been the only constant in this office for 2 years." She shook her head. "Then why did you treat me like I was replaceable?" His jaw tightened. He looked down for a second, then back at her, and when he did, the expression in his eyes changed. Something cracked open, something raw. "Because I didn't want to admit you weren't." Silence hung between them, heavy, charged, full of all the things they'd never said. Emma looked away first. She felt her throat tighten again. She wanted to scream, or cry, or ask why he was only saying this now, when she'd already packed up everything inside herself and accepted the fact that he didn't care, that she didn't matter. "You hurt me," she whispered. "I know. I trusted you. I didn't trust myself." She let out a shaky laugh, part disbelief, part exhaustion. "That's not good enough anymore. I know that too." Another silence, but this one felt different. Not cold, not angry, just quiet. "Finally," she asked, "why now?" Richard exhaled deeply. "Because I didn't think I'd miss you until I saw you standing there with that envelope. And then I realized I've been missing you for months. I just didn't know what to do about it." Emma looked up at him again. He stepped closer, just a few feet away now. "I'm not asking you to stay for the job. I'm asking you to stay, so I can try to make this right, whatever this is. I'm not even sure I know how yet." She held his gaze. There was nothing polished about him now. No performance, just a man admitting, perhaps for the first time, that he didn't have control over everything. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just stood there and breathed. And somehow, in that breath, something shifted, not enough to fix anything, but enough to hold her there a little longer. Outside, the city continued its quiet glow, unaware of the two hearts finally caught between truth and the choice to speak it. Inside that locked office, nothing was decided, but everything had changed. 2 years earlier, the office looked almost the same, sleek, polished, humming with quiet ambition, but for Emma Carlyle, it was an entirely unfamiliar world. She had stepped through those glass doors with a resume that was modest and a reputation built quietly over a decade of steady, unglamorous work. Her references spoke of reliability and unshakable calm, words that comforted hiring managers but never turned heads. Langston and Reeves. Architects was not the kind of firm that took chances on quiet resumes. But Richard Langston had glanced at hers, leaned back in his chair, and said simply, "Let's see if she lasts a month." Emma had heard about him long before she met him. The Richard Langston, The kind of man who could redesign a skyline and dismantle an executive team in the same afternoon. Cold, brilliant, respected, and entirely unreachable. There were rumors, of course, stories traded in the copy room. He once fired someone for calling him by his first name. He didn't believe in birthdays, holidays, or small talk. He lived for deadlines and data and disdain. But when Emma met him on her first day, he only nodded, didn't ask for her name, didn't shake her hand, just handed her a stack of folders and said, "These are yesterday's. Start there." She didn't blink. She took the folders and began. And somehow, quietly, something in him noticed that she wasn't flashy, didn't flirt, didn't try to impress him. Emma simply showed up, early, consistent, unassuming, but exact. She memorized the timing of his meetings, the pacing of his footsteps, the way he liked his reports, stapled on the top left corner, not the right. She learned his schedule down to the minute. His coffee half and half, no sugar, lunch, only if she reminded him. Travel itineraries. She caught a double booking once that could have cost the firm a major deal. She fixed it before he even knew it was broken. But what Richard never saw was how Emma noticed more than just the logistics. She noticed the way he stared at the window longer on Fridays, the way his voice dropped just slightly when he said the word home, as if it were a place he hadn't visited in years. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes after quarterly reports, and how sometimes, just sometimes, he stood in front of the lobby mirror before a board meeting and straightened his tie with trembling hands. She said nothing, not once. And that silence built something. They were never close, not in the way office friendships usually form. They didn't share jokes, or lunch tables, or holiday stories. But there were moments, small ones. One rainy afternoon, he found her in the break room, eating alone. He didn't say a word, just poured himself coffee and stood nearby for a full minute. For Richard Langston, that was practically intimacy. Another day, during a late client call, she slipped a granola bar onto his desk without comment. He didn't thank her, but he ate it. And then there was the Christmas party. Emma didn't plan to go, but the executive assistant had begged her to attend, just to make the numbers look good. She wore a dark green sweater and stood near the back, nursing a cup of punch. Richard arrived 30 minutes late, wearing a charcoal gray suit and an expression that made the room grow quieter. He didn't mingle, just scanned the room, looked directly at her, then looked away. She told herself it meant nothing. Just like she told herself it meant nothing when she found a fresh notepad on her desk every Monday morning, or when she got approval signatures on requests faster than any other department, or when Richard once said, during a staff meeting, "Miss Carlyle is the only person in this room I trust with my calendar." He didn't smile when he said it, but she remembered. She remembered everything. But feelings, especially those that crept in slowly and without permission, were easy to bury under professionalism. She reminded herself, day after day, that she was just a secretary, a background presence, useful, reliable, replaceable, and yet irreplaceable in ways no one acknowledged out loud. Those silent years weren't loud with drama. There were no dramatic gestures or close calls. Only a slow, steady rhythm, like a melody neither of them knew the words to, but still kept humming. And perhaps, somewhere in that quiet space, something more began to take root, but neither dared to look too closely. Not him, with his fortress of distance, not her, with her need to keep things orderly and safe. Until, of course, it all cracked. And cracks, no matter how hairline they begin, always find a way to split wide open. There was no single moment that broke her. No single word, or sharp comment, or failed meeting that sent Emma Carlyle quietly toward the edge. That's the cruel thing about slow-breaking things. They don't announce themselves. They don't slam doors or drop bombs. They wear away at you in silence, like wind-carving rock over time. It began with a change in tone. Richard Langston, always direct and sharp, had started sounding more impatient, where once there was calm precision in his voice. Brief, yes. But measured there, now came clipped responses, disinterest, and the faint edge of irritation. He no longer looked up when she entered the room. He no longer acknowledged the post-it notes she left on his desk with travel adjustments or staff birthdays. His thank yous became nods. His nods became silence. Then came the rumors. Emma heard them first in the elevator, in that hushed, knowing tone people reserve for things they pretend not to care about, but absolutely do. She's definitely not his type, someone whispered. She's the assistant. He's seeing someone younger, marketing consultant, blonde, stunning, Ivy League. She's just a tool. She runs his life, and he forgets she exists the moment he leaves the building. Emma kept her eyes forward, her posture perfect, her face unreadable, but something in her clenched. Not jealousy, she had long buried any fantasy about being the woman in his life. What hurt was how easily people believed she was invisible. How confidently they reduced her to utility. And worse, how little she could argue with them. Then came the gala. A black tie fundraising event for the city's urban housing renewal initiative. An event Richard had supported for years, but rarely attended in person. This time, he went, and he didn't go alone. Emma hadn't planned to watch the local news segment. She had stumbled across it while folding laundry, background noise to a quiet Saturday. But there he was, sharp tuxedo, cool smile, and beside him, a woman with long platinum hair and a red gown that glimmered like a warning flare. The reporter said her name, Alicia Whitman, Strategic Development Advisor, former model, a client's niece. Richard didn't look uncomfortable in the footage. He looked effortless, polished, present. Emma muted the television, stared for a while at the frozen image of the man who, at work, hadn't looked her in the eye for weeks, and still. She came to the office Monday morning at 7:45, just like always. But something had shifted. She moved more like a shadow than a person. She stopped staying late. She stopped refilling the candy jar on the receptionist's desk. She stopped reminding Richard about things he used to forget, choosing instead to let his calendar remind him or let someone else take the blame. It wasn't punishment. It was survival, Richard noticed. Or perhaps he didn't. Either way, he said nothing. Then, one Thursday afternoon, during a senior staff meeting, the crack widened. She had prepared the meeting materials, a set of reports on supplier delays in the North Michigan project. She double-checked every figure, triple-checked, even, but somehow, in the printed version Richard had glanced at, a single page had been duplicated, and another had been left out. It was a simple printer queue error, harmless, fixable. But Richard, midway through discussion, closed the folder with an audible snap and looked directly at her in front of everyone. Next time, maybe check before handing me something incomplete, he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were not. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The room was silent. She nodded once, slowly, her face still, and that night she sat in her small apartment, staring at the same envelope she'd end up handing him weeks later. Blank then. Not even a draft. But the idea had begun. The cracks weren't just in how he treated her. They were in what she had allowed herself to believe that loyalty would protect her, that quiet presence meant something unspoken but solid. She had thought she mattered, but silence, she was learning, doesn't mean significance, it just means silence. And for the first time since she'd walked into that firm, Emma began to ask herself the one question she had always been too proud or too afraid to consider. If I walked away tomorrow, would anyone care? The answer didn't come immediately, but the absence of an answer was answer enough. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way people expect from stories about broken trust or quiet heartbreak. There was no yelling, no slammed doors, no teary confrontation. That wasn't Emma Carlyle's way. She had always dealt with pain the way some people dealt with coffee, slowly, in silence, one sip at a time, until something burned just a little too deep. It started with the rain. Chicago had been caught in a cold snap, the sky low and gray, a fine mist painting the sidewalks in thin reflections. Emma arrived early that morning, earlier than usual, soaked from a brief walk after her train stopped short due to a track delay. Her coat was damp at the edges, her hair frizzed slightly from the humidity. Still, she sat at her desk at 7:38 a.m., logged in, and began responding to emails like she always did. At 8:04, Richard Langston walked past her desk, as he often did, carrying a folder, his phone pressed to one ear. He didn't look at her. He dropped the folder onto her inbox tray with a soft thud, papers spilling slightly from the edge. No good morning. No nod. Emma stared at the folder for a full 10 seconds before reaching for it. As she gathered the scattered pages, she heard voices coming from the hallway, two junior partners, hushed but unaware of her presence. He's taking Alicia to New York next week, one said. Seriously, the other scoffed. That woman's more brand than brain. Well, she's his type, tall, flawless, cold as ice. Emma didn't flinch, not outwardly, but she bit the inside of her cheek until the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. She stood, placed the papers in order, and walked them into Richard's office, setting them neatly on the corner of his desk. He didn't look up. His eyes remained on his monitor, one hand absently turning a pen between his fingers. She walked out without a word, into the restroom, down the hall. There, behind the closed door of the last stall, she sat down fully clothed and exhaled slowly, deeply, until her hands stopped shaking. When she returned to her desk, he was gone. The rest of the morning passed in a haze, meetings stacked one after another. She took notes in silence, typed summaries with precision, coordinated a last-minute lunch appointment for Richard and a visiting investor. Her motions were smooth, her voice calm, her presence, as always, invisible and essential. Until the meeting, it was a 3-hour mem strategy session for the Harborfront project, with all senior staff and several clients in attendance. Emma had prepped the slide deck, double-checked the renderings, and placed printed briefing folders at each seat. The conference room buzzed with low conversation as the meeting began. Richard entered 5 minutes late. Emma rose to hand him the updated documents, but before she could speak, he flipped through the first few pages, stopped, and frowned. "This data's outdated," he said aloud, his voice cutting through the chatter. Emma's hands paused midair. "That's the revised version," she said softly. "We updated the numbers yesterday. It's still incorrect," he snapped, not looking at her. "Next time, check your work before you embarrass both of us." The room fell silent. No one breathed. Emma stood still, the folder still in her hands. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She nodded once and sat down quietly. The rest of the meeting blurred. She didn't hear the proposals or the questions. She only heard that word, echoing inside her chest, embarrass. By the time the room emptied out, her decision had already been made. Back at her desk, she opened a blank document. Her fingers didn't hesitate. Dear Mr. Langston, I hereby tender my resignation, effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity. Sincerely, Emma Carlyle. She printed it, signed it, slipped it into a clean white envelope. Then she gathered her things, slowly, not everything, just enough to leave the space feeling lighter. The small plant from her desk, the pen Richard had given her last Christmas without a card, the notebook she never let anyone see. At 5:12 p.m., she stood in front of his office again. She knocked once. He looked up, clearly not expecting her. His brows lifted briefly, then smoothed. What is it? He asked. She stepped inside, placed the envelope on his desk. I'm resigning, she said, quietly. He didn't open it, not yet. He looked at her hands, steady, empty now. Then he looked at her face. There was no anger there, no resentment, just stillness. You're serious, he said. And this time, there was something different in his voice. Not disbelief, not command, something uncertain, almost afraid. She gave him one last look, one that held everything she wouldn't say, and turned toward the door. Her hand reached for the handle, and in that fragile space between silence and goodbye, the world held its breath. But Richard Langston didn't stop her. Not then, not yet. And maybe that, more than anything, was what finally broke her. The soft click of the door, locking, didn't sound like much, just a quiet shift of metal sliding into place, but in the heavy silence of Richard Langston's office, it echoed with the weight of something far deeper. Emma Carlyle froze, her fingers still barely brushing the cool steel of the door handle. Her back was to him, but she didn't need to turn to know he had stood, walked across the room, and pressed the lock without a word. The air seemed to change thicker, quieter, like the moments before a storm. You're not leaving, he said, his voice quiet but firm, as though the sentence cost him more than he expected. Emma's hand dropped from the handle slowly. She didn't turn around right away. She stood there, still and tall, spine straight, shoulders squared, but her breath betrayed her, rising shallow in her chest. There was a tremor in the stillness, like glass just before it shatters. Please don't do this, she said at last, her voice calm but frayed. Not now, not like this. Richard stepped back from the door, but not far. I should have said something weeks ago, maybe months. She turned then. Slowly, her eyes landing on him, like a challenge she didn't want to give, but no longer cared to hold back. Why didn't you? He looked at her for a long moment, as if gathering the answer, not from his mind, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere less practiced. His shoulders, always stiff with purpose, seemed to slacken just slightly. Because if I said it out loud, he replied, I'd have to admit that I saw what was happening, and I didn't stop it. Emma didn't move. Her silence wasn't permission. It was armor. Richard took another step, slower this time, and reached into the drawer on the side of his desk. He pulled out a thin black folder, nothing special on the outside, no name, no label. He held it toward her. What's this? She asked, not taking it right away. Something I should have given you a long time ago. She stepped forward and took it cautiously. Inside were pages, copied emails, internal memos, personal notes, scribbled in the margins of drafts, clipped sticky tabs in his handwriting. Her name was everywhere, her work, her efforts, her small decisions that had influenced major outcomes, all documented, all acknowledged. Near the back was a letter, dated 8 months ago, typed, unsigned. It was a formal recommendation for a promotion, a significant one. Her fingers stilled on the page. I never saw this. It never made it to the board. He said, I let someone else block it, and I didn't fight them, because I thought, if it looked like I favored you, they'd tear everything you'd built apart just to spite you. Emma blinked, the paper wavering in her hands, and the gala she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated. She's a client's niece, he said. The photo, pure optics. I didn't even know her last name until it showed up in the news. You let people think she mattered to you. I let them think it so they wouldn't look at you, he said, the regret in his tone finally visible, audible, undeniable. Because if they knew what you really meant to me, they'd have torn you apart. And I didn't trust myself not to let them. Emma looked down at the pages again, pages of silent praise, of quiet defense, of invisible protection. You should have let me decide what I could handle, she said. You should have trusted me. I didn't even trust myself, he answered. Her breath caught in her throat. There were so many things she wanted to say. Accusations, truths, wounds that had never scabbed because they'd never been acknowledged. But instead of shouting, instead of crying, she set the folder down gently on the desk and met his gaze. You built an entire fortress of silence, she said softly. And then you locked me out and wondered why I stopped knocking. Richard didn't reply right away. He didn't try to close the distance. He just stood there, the distance between them, not measured in feet, but in everything unsaid. I thought if I stayed cold, it would keep things simple, professional, contained, he said. But it only made you disappear. And now I don't know how to bring you back. Emma's eyes glistened, but not with tears, with clarity. You don't, she replied, because I never left. You just stopped seeing me. The silence that followed was not angry, not cold. It was something else, something deeper, something that tasted like truth. Richard reached slowly for the resignation letter, still on his desk. He didn't rip it. He didn't hand it back. He just placed his palm on top of it, as if anchoring it there, holding time still. I'm not asking you to stay because I need your help, he said. I'm asking because for the first time in a very long time, I want to be the kind of man who deserves to be beside you. Emma didn't move, didn't answer, but she stayed, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because just for that moment, something old had cracked, and something new had begun to breathe. For hours after she left his office that night, Emma Carlyle didn't go home. She didn't go anywhere, really. She walked for blocks in the soft, drifting dark of Chicago's lakefront, her heels clicking faintly against the damp pavement, hands tucked into her coat pockets, the collar turned up against the chill that somehow felt sharper than usual. The city was alive, as it always was, full of light and motion, but Emma's mind moved elsewhere quietly, inward, caught in a whirlwind of words she'd both spoken and withheld. Richard had said the things she once longed to hear. He had shown her that she wasn't invisible, that her work had mattered, that she had mattered. But instead of relief, all she felt was a strange, heavy ache, like waking up after a dream you didn't know you were having, only to realize it was never quite enough. She sat on a bench not far from the water and let the cold seep into her skin. What did it mean to be seen now? After all this time, after carrying silence like armor and professionalism like religion, She wanted to believe him. Some part of her still believed in the version of Richard that only she had noticed, the man who always fixed his tie twice before a major presentation, who kept a handwritten list of every team member's birthday, even if he never mentioned it aloud. But the man in the boardroom, the one who cut her off, who let rumors swirl, who watched her fall apart and said nothing that man had been just as real. And the truth was, she didn't know which one she had more feelings for, the version she built in her mind, or the one who had finally stood before her and spoken honestly. She thought about turning back. She thought about going back to his office, knocking again, asking the question she hadn't dared ask. Why now? Why only when I was walking away? But the thought dissolved almost as quickly as it came, because she already knew the answer. People often don't know what they value until it threatens to leave them. And sometimes, by the time they realize what's slipping away, the damage has already shaped something else inside you, something too quiet to name, but too loud to ignore. Back at her apartment that night, Emma sat in the small kitchen where the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. She placed the black folder Richard had given her on the table, unopened this time, as if afraid to touch again what she wasn't sure she wanted to believe. Could regret rewrite memory? Could one apology undo the fatigue of being unseen for years? The storm wasn't between her and Richard anymore. It was inside her. The next morning, she arrived at the office as she always had. On time, composed, the resignation letter, now folded in her purse, remained unsigned. Richard saw her as she walked through the reception area. He didn't speak, but he watched her, and she knew he was holding back, giving her the space to decide. He had finally understood something that had eluded him for too long. She wasn't someone to be pulled back into place, like a misplaced puzzle piece. She had to choose to be there. And she wasn't sure yet if she would. Later that day, he asked if she had time to speak. She agreed, but not in his office. She led him to the empty conference room with windows facing the lake. He followed without a word, and when the door closed behind them, the silence wasn't awkward. It was weighty. She turned to him slowly, the folder still in hand. I read it again, she said quietly. All of it. He nodded. I meant every word. I know, she replied. But meaning something, after the damage has been done, it doesn't undo the silence. I'm not asking you to forget the silence, Richard said, his voice steady. I'm asking if there's still a way forward in spite of it. Emma looked at him, then not like a subordinate, not like someone waiting for permission, but like a woman finally reclaiming her own narrative. I gave you years of loyalty, she said, and for most of that time, I told myself that what I was getting in return, the quiet trust, the implicit reliance, was enough. But you have to understand something, Richard. Silence isn't trust. Silence is erasure. He swallowed, his hands, which had always moved with purpose, now clasped loosely in front of him. I didn't know how to ask for what I wanted, he said, and I didn't know how to stop giving it, she replied, her voice softer now. That's on me, too. He looked at her, then really looked, and for once, there was no CEO in his eyes, no strategist, just a man standing on the edge of something he never learned how to name. I'm not used to wanting things I can't control, he admitted. Then maybe that's the first thing you have to learn, she said. They stood in that quiet room, the city just beyond the glass, the air still between them. Emma turned to leave, her hand brushing the door handle again. This time, he didn't stop her. But she paused. She didn't open the door. Instead, she looked back at him, the storm inside her no longer furious, but still present, still moving. "I'm not saying yes," she whispered, "but I'm not saying no either." And for now, that was enough. For the next few days, something subtle yet undeniable shifted in the office. The air wasn't exactly different, but people noticed things, as they always did. Emma Carlyle still arrived on time, still walked with that same quiet composure, still kept her desk in perfect order. But there was something in the way she carried herself now, a stillness that no longer whispered obedience, but rather intention. She didn't avoid Richard Langston. She didn't retreat, but she didn't lean in either. Their exchanges became fewer, their words clipped but polite, like two diplomats negotiating a ceasefire with no promises for peace. What no one saw, what Emma kept neatly behind the firm line of her lips, was that the storm inside her hadn't gone away. It had changed shape, no longer a swirl of confusion or grief, but something more potent clarity. And with it came a quiet anger, not wild, not loud, but sharp and justified. The moment came on a Tuesday morning, in a boardroom she'd stepped into hundreds of times before. It was a budget review session, tense from the start. The numbers weren't great. A key project had gone over cost projections, and now the finance department was trying to trace accountability. Richard sat at the head of the long table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Emma stood beside him, as always, a prepared report in hand, documents neatly arranged. But when Leon Graves, head of finance, began questioning the discrepancy in contractor fees, Emma saw it coming, the subtle shift in Richard's posture, the way his gaze narrowed at the line item she'd flagged 2 weeks ago. Leon leaned back, arms folded. "This recommendation came through Miss Carlyle's department," he said, almost casually. Perhaps there was a misjudgment in vetting the contractor. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Richard cut in. "We'll address that separately," he said curtly. "Let's move forward." Emma's hands tightened around the file. He wasn't defending her, not like he said he would. "Again, I'd like to clarify something," Emma said suddenly, her voice calm, but carrying. Every head in the room turned toward her. Even Richard stilled. "The recommendation," she continued, "was submitted to your office 2 weeks ago. Mr. Graves, along with 2 alternate options. I noted the potential overage risk in writing. You selected the contractor personally after the meeting with their legal team." Leon blinked, caught off guard. "I have the memo in our shared correspondence folder," Emma added. "If you'd like me to retrieve it." The silence was heavy, and for the first time, Richard didn't interrupt her. He simply watched. Leon gave a stiff nod, muttered something about checking again, and turned the page. The meeting moved on, but Emma had already moved on too, across a line she hadn't allowed herself to cross until now. Later that afternoon, Richard came to her desk. "Walk with me," he said, his tone unreadable. They stepped into the side corridor, a long stretch of glass and steel that overlooked the north end of the river. The light outside had softened, casting silver reflections on the windows. "You didn't have to speak up like that," he said finally. Emma looked at him, unblinking. "Yes, I did," he exhaled, something between tension and concession. "You were right." "I wasn't trying to be right," she replied. "I was trying to be seen." Richard said nothing for a moment. His jaw shifted slightly, an old habit she'd come to associate with discomfort. "I'm still learning," he said. Emma gave a small nod. "I know." She looked out the window then, at the river far below, the way it flowed steady and unconcerned, never stopping for anything in its path. "I need to know that if I stay," she said, "it's not as your shadow, it's as your equal, not just in title, but in space, in voice." Richard turned to her, his expression bare now, no armor, no deflection. "You've always been more than equal," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to make space without surrendering control." Emma met his gaze, her eyes not hard, but clear. "Then start here," she said. "Start now." He nodded slowly, not a grand promise, but something close to truth, something closer to real. The ripple didn't take long. By midweek, word had spread across departments. Emma Carlisle had stood her ground in the boardroom, in front of the CEO, in front of finance, and Richard Langston had let her. Not only let her, but listened. For a company that had run on unspoken hierarchies and power silences, it was the equivalent of an earthquake. And yet, strangely, the walls hadn't crumbled, the floors hadn't cracked, the sky hadn't fallen. Instead, something else had begun to settle: respect. It came first in glances longer, more curious, not skeptical but wondering. Then in small shifts when Emma entered meetings. Seats were no longer already taken. When she spoke, people took notes. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough to feel the change. It wasn't about admiration. It was about finally being seen as someone who had earned her place at the table, not as someone who was merely allowed to sit there. Still, not everyone liked the shift. Emma knew that. And so did Richard. It happened late on a Thursday, near the break room, a place where reputations often burned quietly behind microwaved lunches and whispered commentary. Emma was walking past when she heard it, a voice, sharp with judgment, clipped with dismissal. She got fast-tracked. Anyone can see that. Langston has a soft spot, that's all. Soft spot, another voice laughed. Please. She played it smart. Work late. Look polite. Don't speak up until it matters. It's classic climbing. Emma paused. She didn't flinch. Not this time. She just stood, hands resting against the folder in her arms, listening not out of shock, but out of familiarity. This wasn't new, only louder. But before she could step away, a second silence fell, heavier, sharper, footsteps, and then his voice. You might want to stop before you embarrass yourselves. It was Richard. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his tone unmistakably clear. The two employees froze, their eyes wide, their words evaporated. Miss Carlisle, he continued, is where she is because she's earned it every position, every advancement, every ounce of trust. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. He paused, just long enough to let the air grow dense around them. If you can't respect that, he added, you're working for the wrong company. And then he walked away, catching Emma's gaze only briefly as he passed. No wink, no smile, just a look, a flicker of something between recognition and apology. Emma stood still for a few more seconds. The hallway had never felt quieter. Later that afternoon, she passed by his office. The door was open. He looked up as she approached. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes. He replied, I did. And just like that, something in her shifted again, because this time he hadn't defended her behind closed doors. He had done it where it counted. The days that followed brought more changes, not dramatic ones, but meaningful. Richard stopped eating lunch alone in his office. On 3 separate days, he joined staff in the main break room. On one of those days, he pulled out a chair beside Emma and asked her opinion on a scheduling dilemma. not after the meeting, not in private, but in front of everyone. Small things, yes. But they mattered because power, when used quietly to uplift, echoes longer than any grand gesture, and perhaps the most surprising part, Emma didn't retreat from it. She didn't downplay, deflect, or explain it away. She stepped into the light he'd opened for her and stood there not demanding space, but refusing to shrink. One evening, as most of the staff cleared out, Emma remained behind reviewing a contract timeline. The office had that quiet hum it always did after 5, the sound of computers humming, HVAC systems clicking, elevators sighing far down the hall. Richard appeared in the doorway. "You're still here," he said, not as a question, but a kind of recognition. She looked up, her pen resting on the edge of a yellow legal pad, just tying up a few things. He stepped in. Not rushed, not rehearsed. "I wanted to say thank you." Emma blinked. "For what? For calling me out, for making space, for showing me how to be better without demanding it." She gave a soft smile, one that didn't reach for warmth, but offered it. "I didn't do it to change you, Richard. I did it to keep myself from disappearing." "I know," he said, "but sometimes what we do for ourselves becomes the thing someone else finally learns from." He didn't stay long, just long enough for the moment to hold. When he left, Emma sat still for a long time, her hand resting lightly over the contract page, her eyes fixed on the skyline beyond the window, soft pinks and blues brushing the high rises, and quiet goodnight. Something had turned, not because they declared it, but because they had earned it. It was a Friday evening when he asked her. The office had thinned out by 6, the sky outside already shifting into a soft navy hue that melted against the glass windows. Most of the staff had long gone off to their weekend plans, their families, their distractions. But Emma Carlyle remained, as she often did, finishing one last timeline draft before shutting her laptop. She didn't hear Richard approach. She only noticed him when his reflection appeared beside hers in the window, a quiet shadow made human by the gentle rustle of a coat sleeve and the soft breath he released, as though he, too, had been holding something in all day. "Walk with me," he asked, his voice softer than usual. Emma hesitated only for a second before nodding. They stepped into the elevator without speaking. Descended in the hush of soft metal hums and quiet anticipation. Outside, the night air was cool, edged with the scent of lake wind and city stone. Richard didn't say where they were going, and Emma didn't ask. It wasn't the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was the kind that asked to be honored. They walked for several blocks, past the familiar glow of late diners and the dull hum of traffic. The streets weren't crowded, only scattered with the occasional couple, the soft bark of a dog, the clink of glasses through cafe windows. Richard's hands stayed in his coat pockets, his steps steady, unrushed. He walked not ahead of her, as he often did in meetings, but beside her. They turned a corner Emma didn't recognize, onto a quieter street, lined with trees and brownstones. At the end stood a small park, modest, tucked away, nearly hidden. A bench sat beneath a tall oak tree, leaves whispering overhead in the late autumn breeze. Richard paused there and gestured gently. "Let's sit." They did. For a long moment, neither spoke. Emma glanced at him, his profile outlined against the soft glow of the nearby street lamp. He didn't look like a CEO in that moment. He didn't look like the man who once refused eye contact in meetings or dropped files without a word. He looked still, present, and oddly open. I used to come here after my father died, Richard said, finally breaking the silence. He wasn't a kind man, but when he passed, I didn't feel grief. I felt untethered, like I didn't have anything left to prove. Emma listened, her hands folded in her lap. I realized then how much of my life was built around being hard to hurt. He continued, and somewhere along the way, I confused that with being strong. He turned to look at her. You never confuse the two, he said. You've always been strong, quietly, steadily, and I never told you that. You didn't have to, Emma replied, her voice soft. I wasn't looking for praise. I know, he said. That's why it mattered. Another long silence followed, comfortable, reflective. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn box. Emma's breath caught, not in surprise, but in the sheer simplicity of the gesture. He didn't make a speech. He didn't kneel. He just opened the box slowly, revealing a delicate silver band, elegant, timeless, nothing showy or elaborate. I don't want to be just your boss, he said quietly. I don't want to pretend you're just someone who fills calendars and corrects my timing. I don't want to build things without you professionally, personally, in whatever way you'll let me. She looked at the ring, her heartbeat steady, but loud in her chest. Are you sure? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Richard met her gaze, his eyes clearer than she'd ever seen them. I've never been more sure of anything, he said. Emma didn't reach for the ring right away. She looked past him for a moment, toward the still branches overhead, the soft, golden spill of the city just beyond the trees. Her mind filled with quiet snapshots the first day she met him, the emails he never sent, the silence that had both bound and bruised them, the moment he defended her without a second thought. She thought about all the years she'd spent building her life on reliability, on calm, on being the steady one. And for the first time, she allowed herself to want something more. Not grand, not perfect, just real. She turned back to him and smiled small, but full. Yes, she said simply. Richard exhaled, not in relief, but something quieter. Gratitude, maybe, or something like hope. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch gentle, almost reverent. There was no applause, no witnesses, no declarations shouted into the night, but in that quiet corner of the city, beneath a canopy of rustling leaves and dim stars, something binding was said, without ever needing to be spoken aloud. On Monday morning, the elevator doors opened on the 27th floor, just as they always did softly. Without fanfare, with that low mechanical sigh that seemed to set the tone for the start of another work week. But this time, something was different. Emma Carlyle stepped out first. She was calm, composed, as she had always been. Her suit was simple navy, tailored her stride, unhurried, her chin slightly lifted, not in defiance, but in quiet steadiness. And behind her, just a few steps away, walked Richard Langston. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't distracted by emails or in the middle of urgent thoughts. He was simply walking with her, not ahead of her, and the few early arrivals who caught the moment stilled for just a second, their conversations pausing mid-sentence, their expressions flickering with curiosity and something else. Respect. They didn't hold hands. There was no need. Their closeness was quiet but undeniable. At her desk, Emma sat down as usual, greeting her team with that familiar nod, replying to the morning emails with practiced grace. But there was a new kind of stillness in the air. Not tension, not suspicion, recognition. Just before the 9 Ozra meeting, Richard passed by her desk, paused, and said, in full hearing of several staff. We'll review the Jensen file together later this morning. I want your thoughts on how we present it. Emma looked up, nodded once. I'll be ready. He didn't linger. He didn't have to. The moment had said more than enough. The rest of the day unfolded in quiet rhythm. Meetings, calls, updates, business as usual. But the glances shifted. Conversation softened. The undercurrent of office speculation began to settle, replaced not by approval or gossip, but by a sense of understanding. The story was no longer about a CEO and his assistant. It was about two people who had weathered something together and come through the other side changed. That afternoon, after most of the building had emptied, Emma remained at her desk, reviewing final adjustments for a regional proposal. The lights overhead dimmed to their evening hue, casting long amber shadows across the floor. Richard appeared in the doorway of her new office, smaller than his, but bright, with its own window. You done for the day? He asked, leaning against the frame. She looked up, her lips curving slightly, just about. He walked in, slow, unhurried, and sat across from her, his elbows resting casually on the arms of the chair, his fingers interlocked. I've been thinking, he said. That sounds dangerous, she teased lightly. He smiled, rare, but real. You've changed things. She raised a brow. Me. You made me better, he said simply. And not just here. Emma tilted her head, studying him. What brought that on? He looked toward the window, toward the skyline, dusted in dusk. Because I realized that leadership without humanity is just control, he said. And I've had control my whole life. What I haven't had until you was someone willing to tell me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. Someone who stayed, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, You almost let me go. He looked back at her, his gaze steady. And I never will again. Later that evening, they walked out of the building together. The night air was crisp, the streetlights flickering gently as they turned onto the sidewalk. No one followed, no one photographed, just two people. Colleagues, companions, something more moving forward at the same pace. They stopped near the corner, where the city opened up into a view of the river. Richard looked out across the water, his voice softer than the wind. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come back? Emma shook her head, her hand sliding lightly into his. No, she said, because we're here now. That's all that matters. He turned to her then, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. No grand plans, no promises wrapped in glitter, just presence, and that was enough. Weeks turned into quiet routines. Emma stepped fully into her new role, no longer executive assistant, but chief of staff. The title wasn't the reward. The respect was. Richard adapted too. He listened more, asked more, smiled. Sometimes, not often. But when he did, it didn't look like an accident. And through all of it, they kept their bond private, not secret, not denied, but held with care. They didn't owe anyone a performance. They just showed up for each other. One Friday, months later, as the office prepared to close early for a holiday weekend. Richard appeared at Emma's office door, again this time with 2 cups of coffee and a small smile. Still with me? He asked gently. Emma took the cup, her fingers brushing his for a moment. Always, she said. And in that simple exchange, in that quiet space, between everything that had happened and everything still to come, the truth settled deep. She wasn't staying because he asked her to. She was staying because she chose to. Because sometimes love doesn't announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it whispers, I see you. I've always seen you. And I'm not going anywhere. As we grow older, we learn that love isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's hidden behind silence. Sometimes it arrives too late or almost too late. This story reminds us that being seen is not a luxury. It's a need. Whether in work, in family, or in love, every person deserves to feel valued, not just for what they do, but for who they are when no one's watching. Emma Carlisle teaches us something powerful, that quiet strength is not weakness, that choosing to walk away when you're no longer respected is a form of dignity. And when love finally shows up with honesty and humility, it's never too late to begin again if the heart is willing. For anyone who's ever felt overlooked or unheard, this story is a gentle reminder. You are not invisible, and your worth does not depend on who notices you, but on how you choose to honor yourself. Thank you for spending these quiet moments with us. If this story touched something in you, we invite you to share it with someone who may need a gentle reminder that they matter. 2. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Every click helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. Until next time, take care of your heart and stay close to what's real.